Okay, aloha everybody and welcome to our June Marine Science Talk story. And today is going to be a fun one. It is all about seabirds. And so we have Lindsay Young, who is Executive Director of Pacific Rim Conservation. And we also have Dr. Sheldon Plentovich, who's the Pacific Islands Coastal Program Coordinator for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so I'm just going to get right to it. We're going to pass it right to Lindsay. And I'm thank you to both of you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to learning from both of you today. So Lindsay, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming today. And so I'm going to try and share my screen here. Once I get the PowerPoint up, I can't always see you guys. So someone can give me a thumbs up that they can actually see what's going on here. Okay, cool.
Yeah. It looks beautiful.
Young, I'm the Executive Director of Pacific Rim Conservation, and we're a nonprofit group based here in Hawaii. We were founded in 2006, and our mission is to conserve native bird diversity within Hawaii and across the Pacific. So most of our work is within the Hawaiian Islands, primarily on Oahu and Kauai, but we do work, as our name suggests, across the Pacific in a variety of regions. And our main focus is about 75% seabirds. So we do a lot of work with albatrosses, shearwaters, petrels. But our overall arching theme are birds. So I'm going to go through what I think is how we solve the Hawaiian bird extinction crisis through invasive species removal and climate change. And really, seabirds are kind of a great venue to explore this, to start to understand our forest birds, because as most of you know, it's pretty tough to see a forest bird these days, especially if you're on Kauai. It's actually a little bit easier on Oahu, ironically, but nonetheless, seabirds are the most common native bird species that a lot of us are going to see, and where the most visible conservation gains have been made. So I'm going to give you a brief history on Hawaiian bird conservation, potential extinctions, how we're going to hopefully stop that, and then what's being done today. So if you have questions, because I can't really see what's going on with you guys, if you can put them in the chat just as a placeholder, or if you remember them, just we'll talk about it at the very end. So this is a painting of the Hawaiian honeycreeper radiation. So it's often said that if Darwin had come to the Hawaiian Islands as opposed to the Galapagos, a theory of evolution would have been formed in the Hawaiian archipelago. As you can see, this gray bird right in the middle here, from this one tiny finch-like ancestor, radiated dozens of endemic native honeycreepers and various finches throughout the Hawaiian archipelago. So we're one of the best examples of what's called adaptive radiation, of multiple species coming from a single species, really anywhere in the world. And the same thing that facilitates this explosion of evolution also makes our birds really vulnerable, because as you can see, a lot of them in this picture have really unique adaptations that make them really specialized. So we have the Akiapula owl here that has this really cool hooked bill, and it's meant for getting really underneath the bark, specifically of koa trees, to get at insects. And so once you lose koa, you might lose these birds. And same thing with palila. These are birds here. They have this special hook-like beak that goes from mamane seeds, and the mamane has to be blooming year-round, which requires an elevational gradient. So they're really specialized in terms of what they need. And the second you get something that's really specialized, once you throw off that niche, it makes them really vulnerable to extinction. And so what's actually happened is, since the arrival of humans, a lot of our birds have unfortunately gone extinct. So the benchmarks here, 1778 is the arrival of Europeans. So from the arrival of Polynesian settlers to the arrival of Europeans, we had about 42% of our native bird species known from the fossil record go extinct. From the time the Europeans arrived until about statehood, we had an additional 29% go extinct. So what we're left with today, we have 29% of the native bird species that we once have had. And if you look at that, the vast majority of these, think of now what we have today as just being this yellow and green part of the pie, the vast majority of them are endangered. So we have very few species that are doing well. So why? Why are these things going extinct? One of the reasons we're having a hard time fixing this is because of the funding situation. So Dave Leonard, who used to work for Hawaii Division of Forestry and Wildlife, did a study to figure out what was it about the funding situation that was so bad in Hawaii. And he found that we had 1/3 of the endangered birds in the whole country, despite having less than 1% of landmass, less than 1% of the population, but we only get 4% of the funding. So we have a huge discrepancy between the need and the resources that we're given. And a big part of that is because resources are given to those who scream the loudest. And those who scream the loudest on behalf of endangered species are usually those things that get in the way of development. So think like spotted owls, things that are getting in the way of logging companies going in. A little Oahu Elepaio, which is what you see here, is not really getting in anyone's way. So out of sight, out of mind means out of money, basically. And so because we don't have these controversial species that the mainland does, we don't get the same level of funding. And that's kind of where our organization fits in. We try and help fill that funding gap by bringing together private donors as well as philanthropic organizations to help fund this. And where Sheldon's program that you're going to hear about, the coastal program, is really important to stemming this. So I just went through this. What are the threats to our native birds? So the primary threat to seabirds in particular are non-native predators, as you see here on the right. The top is a picture of about 150 dead wedge-tailed shearwaters from a cat and a dog over the period of a couple of days at Kaena Point. This is in 2006, before the fence went up. And then the bottom is a cat eating a Laysan albatross. So because all of our birds evolved with essentially nothing furry, anything mammalian is not from here with the exception of our bat, and all of our birds are really vulnerable, they also eat all of them. Our birds have no natural fear response. The second threat is habitat degradation. So particularly for forest birds, but also for seabirds, once the habitat structure is gone, it makes it really hard. And this photo in the background, you can see all that's separating this beautiful native forest on the right from open pasture land is a fence. And the thing that's causing that destruction is what you see over here in the distance is a cow. So all of the food animals we brought in and the clearing that we did degrades the habitat, unfortunately. Climate change is an up and coming and current problem that's exacerbating all these threats. So it's changing habitat degradation, accelerating it. It also facilitates new invasive species coming and exacerbates the ones we have. And then coupled with this is introduced disease, which I'm going to get into. Okay, so I've gone through all the bad things, and it is pretty depressing working in this space, I'm not going to lie, but there's actually some really good news. So on January 1st, 2019, we had a Hawaiian endemic land snail go extinct. And a group of us got together and thought, okay, what is going on across all of our taxa, across the invertebrates, which are the insects, across plants, across the birds? What is causing things to go extinct and how can we actually fix it? And this to me was what was really heartening. So if you look at the answers that all these experts gave, so these are our groups now. So these are basically, think of it as bugs, plants, and birds. If you look at the primary threat, we actually know what these primary threats are. There are very few orange, which is unknown across all of these groups. I know that sounds weird, but knowing what the threat is actually huge because then you can start to fix it. And the thing that most of these had in common was predation or herbivory in the case of plants. So direct consumption by something that was not native to the area. If you look at the bar graph on the right, so this is the action status of what's needed to actually recover those species. You can see that, again, the orange, the unknown, is really, really small. So we actually know what to do for most of these species. And even where there's some unknowns, like let's say we need some technological advances, still pretty small. For the vast majority, we actually know what to do. It's just a matter of funding and political will to get it done. So this is the good news. We have a blueprint for what the problem is and how to solve it. We just need to get to the solving part. So I'm going to go through how we address some of these threats. So protecting things in situ. What this means is protecting something that is in sight, sitting in the location that it's in without moving it. So landscape level predator control is a super important tool for our forest birds as well as our seabirds. So what you see here are Oahu Elepaio. This is one of our endemic forest birds, our meaning the island of Oahu. Everyone thinks we don't have these, but we do. And so if you look at this graph, it might be a little hard to see, but basically the white is where Oahu Elepaio were found in the 1970s. You can see primarily throughout the Ko'olaus with some pockets in the northern Waianaes. And then in the 1990s, these are the crosshatched ones. You can see it was constricted quite a bit. So in a 20-year period, their range shrunk by about 75%. And so my co-founder of Pacific Rim Conservation, Eric van der Werf, as part of his PhD work, wanted to know what was the effect of rat control on these little birds. And so he did rat control, and within a single year saw a huge difference. So what this means on the left, think of this axis as the number of chicks produced per bird. So if you want a growing population, you want it to be above 1. You want to at least replace yourself or have a few more. When there's no rodent control happening, you're losing your population pretty rapidly. And that's what we see here. But when he started to do rat control, you could keep it at about 1 or actually exceed that. And so the effect was so strong, he started not measuring no rodent control because he would just do rodent control because it was so effective. And the cool thing is this is what you see in the graph. So now this whole shaded area, you can see is larger in 2012 than it was in the 1990s. So with rat control, Elapaio were able to survive and then expand. So it actually works. The sad thing about this, though, is it means that this species is what we call conservation reliant. We have to do rat control every single year or we're going to lose these guys. So if you want to know more about the Oahu Elapaio and how we kind of, between Pacific Rim Conservation and Army Environmental and Division of Forestry and Wildlife, that's what's keeping this species alive at this point. So it's really critically important that we do rodent control for these guys. Okay, so the other way we can do it is not just controlling things, but what about fully getting rid of them? So this is right off of Kahuku. This is Mokuauia, or Goat Island. And as most of you know, it's pretty close to Mele Kahana. You can walk out there at low tide or pretty easily paddle out there. Unfortunately, it means it's a lot of opportunities for rats to actually stow away in your kayaks or potentially swim out there. So in 2012, I believe, we partnered with Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and we eradicated rats from the island. And what we saw afterwards was the shearwaters went way, way up. So the nesting wedgies that were out there, wedge-tailed shearwaters, were able to breed much more successfully. So there's a thriving wedge-tailed shearwater colony that's now colonizing other areas because there's no more space left, essentially, on Mokuauia because they were released from predation. So on this spot, because it's a small area, we can protect against things coming back in, we're able to eradicate them. But what about areas, on the mainland part of Oahu where we can't actually prevent things from coming in, but still want to eradicate them? That's where predator exclusion fencing comes in. Sorry, I'm just gonna have a drink. My voice is getting a little hoarse. Okay, and that's just bubbly water in case you're wondering what's in the can. So these are fences that can keep out anything furry, anything mammalian. So they're tall enough that things can't jump over, and they have a rolled hood so they can't climb, and then a really fine chain link mesh that's about the size of the tip of your pinky so that rodents can't get through. So the combination of all of this means that cats, dogs, mongoose, rats, even mice can't get into fenced areas. And when we fence off areas and then get rid of the predators on the inside, really interesting things can happen. So a lot of you have probably been out to Kaena Point. If you haven't, I strongly recommend going there. And for those that are not familiar, Kaena Point is often called one of the last intact coastal dune ecosystems in the Hawaiian Islands. And I like to point out that it's actually the first restored coastal dune ecosystem. So Kaena Point was a military reservation for decades. It was basically completely defoliated. There was almost no vegetation left and cars running everywhere. So it was just a mess, and photographs from the Bishop Museum in the early 1900s sort of indicate as such. And so in the 1990s, it was designated as a natural area reserve, and vehicles were prevented from entering the area, and all of a sudden things started taking off. So there were a lot of shearwaters that started nesting there, albatross started nesting, and predator control was initiated, but there was still a lot of predation that was happening. So even with predator control, we were still getting these large shearwater kill-offs. You're still getting albatross eaten by cats and mongoose. And more importantly, the whole ecosystem was being modified by the rodents. These are sandalwood seeds that have been gnawed by rats and mice, and shearwater eggs that have been chewed by them. So the combination of all of this really prevented the full recovery, not just of the birds, but also of the plants. And so a predator exclusion fence was put in 2011, and we immediately saw a response. So this is a graph of wedge-tailed shearwater nesting success. You can see they started in 1994, went from 0. And this is about when cars were barricaded in 1992, I believe. So they started nesting, started picking up. Predator control started in 2000, and things actually went quite a bit up. And you can see it's pretty variable. We didn't count for a few years, and there would be some bad years. It'd go up and down. Predator fence was put in right about here, and this is the year predators eradicated. Or sorry, this was the year predators were eradicated. They doubled and then they doubled again the next year, and they've continued to go up. And I actually don't even have the latest graph. You'll notice the number of chicks that were produced was 6,000. Last year it was 13,000. So it doubled last year. And that's because these first big years, right after the fence was built, those chicks have now come back and are now breeding. So we're now seeing the second generation. So Kaena Point has 13,000 pairs of wet-shelled shearwaters, which means more than 26,000 birds from zero in 1994. So these management activities, they take a long time, but the gains you can see from them really are pretty extraordinary. So a seabird response to the removal of rats, which might seem pretty innocuous. I mean, they're annoying when they're in our house, but they're really pretty devastating to the whole ecosystem. It can double the reproductive output. What that means is it doubles the number of chicks that you're able to produce. And if we don't remove these in places where we have listed seabirds, so the endangered ones like mule shearwaters and Hawaiian petrels, it's going to prevent the recovery of those species. So something that we've been doing for the last 15 years is partnering with national wildlife refuges to help recover some of the species. So I'm going to focus on Honouliuli, which is kind of down on the southwest side of Oahu, Kilauea Point on Kauai, and then James Campbell and Midway Atoll to talk about what we've done there. So we worked to fence Honouliuli, which was the first wetland fence put in Hawaii in 2018. And this was super fascinating. So we knew that the seabirds are responding to the removal of predators, but water birds are unique in that they lay more than one egg. And so not only did they see an increase in the reproductive success, which we kind of expected, like you remove the predators, they can produce more chicks, they actually laid more eggs. And so what has been found in water birds is when they have a fear response to something, when they're scared of predators, they don't produce as many babies, like they just won't even lay as many eggs. When you remove that, they actually laid more eggs. So instead of having a clutch of 2 eggs per nest, they had between 3 and 4. So the response for stilts, in particular at Honouliuli, was enormous, like way more than we were expecting, which was really, really neat. So to talk about this, the main points are eradication of removing predators completely through fencing or if you're on an island versus controlling them. Eradicating them, you might have a high initial investment, but it might be comparable in cost over time because you're not constantly having to control them. And it achieves what we call biological outcome, a number of birds that's just impossible in predator control. So for plants and animals on the verge of extinction, that might be the only option that we have to recover them. And so as we learn more about how to do these things and how to get rid of things on a large scale, it really truly benefits the birds and the ecosystem. Okay, what about areas where birds are not found there? How do we bring them back in? So this is kind of the, if you ever watch Field of Dreams, the Kevin Costner movie, Build It and They Will Come. This is the social attraction and translocation method. So what you're looking at here is Kilauea Point National Wildlife Refuge on Kauai. The lighthouse is kind of over in this area, and this is the Mokulea section that's kind of close to the public. And in 2012, we worked with them to construct a fence, which is what you see here. And we chose the site based on lighting and proximity to the ocean. We didn't want the birds in there to be able to see any lights, and we wanted it to be a straight shot out to the ocean. Unfortunately, the habitat within this fence was really pretty bad. This is all Christmasberry and junky weeds. And so we spent a few years restoring kind of an acre at a time, which is what you see here. We'd come out and clear everything and then outplant 10,000 native plants, put in burrows. And over time, we've restored about 2/3 of this area. So we got the habitat ready, which took quite a long time. And then we started to bring the birds back. So why are we doing this? So on top of all the threats we've talked about, we have the predation threat, we have habitat loss. Sea level rise is really pretty critical to a lot of our seabirds. So the vast majority of Hawaii's birds nest within Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea Marine National Monument, which is the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And those islands are rapidly eroding due to sea level rise. Some cases up to 15 feet a year. We have several islands that have been washed away in the last few years. And so it's displacing a lot of species. And so the way that we do this is creating what we call mainland islands through the fencing that I just described. And then we translocate or attract birds back into those safe areas. And so a lot of people say like, okay, if this bird's nest gets washed out to sea and it no longer has an island, it's going to find somewhere to breed. And that is correct. Our birds will find new coastlines to nest on. But the reality is that the coastlines on the high islands that are going to be safe from sea level rise, 99% of that area is taken over by human development. And so this might be in somebody's front lawn, it might be in a location that is not safe for the bird or where it's not welcome or not protected. And so guiding these animals into areas that are safe on these refuges that are going to be protected in perpetuity is super important to ensuring that they have colonies and safe locations on the high islands. So what we have been doing is selecting the islands within the Marine National Monument, which you can see extends about 1,500 miles northwest of us, and bringing them to both Oahu and Hawaii. The species that we focus on are Laysan and black-footed albatrosses, and then Bonin petrel and Tristram storm petrel. And these were selected because the US is responsible for the vast majority of the species habitat, meaning as a country, we have the responsibility to conserve them. And also because the vast majority of these species nest below 2 meters in sea level rise, which is actually not even accurate anymore. We want them to nest at least above 3 meters to be able to withstand it. So since 2015, we've been bringing Laysan albatross. We started with Blackfoots in 2017, and then the smaller burrow nesters in 2018. So translocation involves moving species from one area to the other in hopes that they nest or return to their new location. For all of these species, we move them as chicks. So we essentially take them away from their parents and then we hand raise them until they fledge at the new location. Albatross imprint on their birth site when they're about 1 month old. And so if we take chicks before they're a month old and move them, they'll come back to the location they're moved to. These two birds nest underground in burrows and they imprint when they see the night sky for the first time. And so we feed them until they leave on their own. And the cool thing about these species is their parents don't provide any parental care once they leave the nest. So learning how to find food, do all that, it's instinctual to them. It's not something that's taught. And so once they fly away, these guys are wild birds, and then they come back and breed at the new colony as wild birds and start a self-sustaining colony. So these are the 4 species. And so I want to walk through what climate change actually looks like in the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. It's a little harder to visualize on Oahu just because we are on a high island, but when you're at sea level, it can be pretty intense. So this is a picture on Turn Island, and you can see that when you're at sea level and you've got 20-foot surf coming in on the break, it's a little bit unnerving. And you can see these guys nesting right there where things get washed over. And in 2011, we got a really big preview of what was going to come with the Japanese tsunami. And so even though a tsunami is not caused by sea level rise, the height of the wave that came through was actually about what we're expecting to come through the Northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So this is Eastern Island before the tsunami, and you can see right at sea level, birds nesting every couple of yards. It's very dense. This is what a normal albatross colony looks like. And this is immediately afterwards. So basically most of the island had been overwashed. And so Eastern and Sand Island, which are part of Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, are the most important nesting islands for both Laysan and black-footed albatross. On top of the overwash that happens with these things, as sea level rises, there's a freshwater lens underneath these islands, and in heavy rain events, they actually get flooded from the bottom up. And so this is a bird sitting in freshwater in heavy rain because the freshwater lens has come up from underneath. So they get flooded from 2 different directions on these islands. And so this is what it looks like, the modeling, and I think this might actually be out of date now because it's from 2015. So if we look at passive inundation, just think of it as you're giving your kid, think of it as an adult taking a bath. You fill up your tub, it's not splashing anywhere, you can get in, water level rises relatively predictably. For those of you that have children or have tried to give a child or a dog a bath, when you throw them in the tub, this happens. So everything goes everywhere. And this is the same analogy for wave-driven flooding. So you might have the baseline level right here, but as soon as you get waves or storm surges, it washes across the whole thing. So we're losing a good portion of Midway Atoll, which is where millions of these birds nest. In May of 2018, this is what East Island and French Frigate Shoals looked like. After Hurricane Walaka in October of 2018, it was functionally gone. And this island comes and goes a little bit. There's still a small sand spit that forms, but it's no longer suitable nesting habitat. This is where 2,000 black-footed albatross pairs nested up until October 2018. We've been documenting black-footed albatross visits on Oahu since 2006, and it was steady, you know, between 5 and 10 individuals a year, and then all of a sudden in 2018, it shot up to close to 90. So we saw a huge increase in albatross visitation rates on Oahu as a result of their habitat being displaced. So when we translocate the chicks, I told you we take them from their parents. The official term is chick napping, I believe. So we select birds that are big and healthy and are also right on the beach. So the ones that are most likely to be washed away. They are put in pet carriers. And if they're on Midway Atoll, you see them smiling because they're on a plane, and a pretty nice plane at that, because it's a charter to get up there. They're taken from other islands. I mean, we're smiling because we're on deck, but it's by ship. So we've done both by ship as well as by plane. Strongly prefer by plane, but we're able to remove birds either way to bring them back. On Kauai, where we do this at Kilauea Point, we're bringing Newell shearwaters and Hawaiian petrels down. We usually do this by helicopter, so they're flown down from their mountain sites. And in this case, these guys are not as vulnerable to sea level rise, these two species, but they are highly vulnerable to invasive predators. So they're being taken to safer coastal sites that don't have light pollution and that don't have predators. Once the species are within the fenced area, they're hand raised. So they're given a combination of fish and squid or a fish and squid smoothie, and they're fed until they naturally fledge on their own. So this is what the smoothie looks like. This is a Newell shearwater being fed on Hawaii. And we also give them social stimuli. So this is in the form of decoys and sound system. And this little guy, this was a chick from, I believe, 2017, and loved this decoy. Like when we have little A-frame shelters to give them shade, wasn't having any of it. He wanted to sit next to his plastic heron, and that was him, the same bird. At the end of the season, you can see on the bottom right, we banned all of these guys, so we know who they are. And this was one of our favorites. We named this guy Griffin. And the banding is really helpful because if something happens, we're notified. So Griffin was 200 miles northwest of Oahu last year when he was killed in the Hawaii longline fishery. So he almost made it home, and our ahi fishery got him. So even in a highly regulated fishing environment, even with all the stuff we're doing to protect against sea level rise, against predators, they're still vulnerable at sea, which I think is really important to emphasize, that these guys transition the land and the ocean threats are a lot harder to mitigate. So I have a short video. I think what I'm going to do actually is come back to that so that we can take questions, and I want to make sure Sheldon has enough time to get through her talk. And then if we do have time, we can watch that video. But in short, we've moved, this is actually as of last month, over 700 individuals of 6 species since 2015. And 93% of those survived the process, and all of them have returned as adults. So we have Hawaiian petrel, Bowman petrel, and Tristram storm petrel now breeding. We're still waiting on the albatrosses. It takes them 8 years before they actually come back to breed. And our first year was 2015. So this should be our first breeding year of returning nesting birds. We do have wild birds that are now breeding. And the neat thing is that at James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge in Kahuku, there were 0 seabirds breeding there when we started this in 2015. And we now have 4 out of the 20 species found in Hawaii breeding there. So we have 20% of our native seabird species breeding on the refuge as a result of this. So they're breeding in a place that's safe for them, that's going to be protected, and where they're not going to be as vulnerable to sea level rise as where they are. And these are some of the pictures of our returning birds. So this is one that was translocated as a chick coming back, same thing with this guy. And these are wild adults that have been attracted to the area. And so then the final thing that I wanted to briefly talk about in terms of climate change and disease was the mosquito issue. So a lot of you have probably heard about the fate of our forest birds and avian disease. And what happens is we didn't have mosquitoes in Hawaii before humans arrived. So when mosquitoes arrived, they're a vector for disease, all sorts of human diseases from dengue fever to malaria. Same thing for our forest birds. They had no natural immunity to diseases, and they also didn't have a vector. And when mosquitoes arrived, they brought with them avian malaria and avian pox. And birds that were vulnerable to these diseases basically went extinct pretty quickly. And the only ones that are left are those that have some level of resistance in the case of Oahu. So Oahu Elapaio, Amakihi, and Apapane are 3 native forest bird species on Oahu have resistance. Or on the other islands, they're able to find areas to persist where the habitat is above the mosquito line. What the mosquito line is, it's basically at about 1,500 meters, which is a little over 4,000 feet. Above that is too cold for mosquitoes, and so they're not able to breed. So any island that is greater than 4,000 feet has a little bit of habitat that's too cold for mosquitoes. Oahu, our highest peak, is right at about 4,000. So there's no space left on Oahu. Maui and the Big Island have quite a bit, but Kauai, it's rapidly shrinking. So Kauai is just at about 5,000 feet. And if you think of it getting warmer and warmer, this line moves higher and higher. So Kauai, they're essentially being shrunk out because it gets warmer and warmer at the top of the mountain. And that's why you've probably heard a lot in the news about Kauai's forest birds. And it's a result of warming weather increasing the height at which mosquito, or the elevation at which mosquitoes can be found. So again, this didn't happen until 1826. We actually know when mosquitoes arrived, and we believe avian malaria was introduced somewhere between 1900 and 1960. So it's been a relatively short period of time, but it's been the greatest threat that our forest birds have. Seabirds are not as susceptible to disease because they do come in contact with other birds outside of the island environment. So they have generally a stronger immune system than our forest birds do. Okay, so I want to end with this, and that solutions actually exist. So to bring us back to this slide, there are very few actions that had unknown solutions. Most of them were known. We know how to fence things. We know how to get rid of predators. We know how to actually get rid of mosquitoes. It's just actually implementing it. And usually that barrier is either a funding barrier, or in many cases, it's actually a political will. So people are often really keen to testify against things that they don't like, but more often than not, they're not going to voice support for things they do like. And I think that's really important to point out at this point. So for our forest birds, and I know you guys wanted me to talk about seabirds, but I do have to give a plug for forest birds. Right now, mosquito control is in the decision-making stage, and that will make or break whether these species on Kauai go extinct in the next 2 to 5 years. So not in some hypothetical future, in the next 2 to 5 years, those 2 species will go extinct on Kauai without mosquito control. So if you see public opportunity to comment on things like that, please do in a positive setting. It's okay to express concern as well. That's also important, but it's really important to make sure that we positively support these projects. Because as you saw at the beginning, a lot of our stuff has gone extinct. We have the chance to prevent that and stop that and actually restore things at this point. And we need your support for doing it. So the first step is actually educating yourself on it. So if you're at this talk, thank you for taking the first step. And with that, I just want to end with my favorite quote, which translates into no task is too big when done together by all. We truly can actually make a huge difference in the areas that we live in by just cooperating and working towards a common goal. So with that, all the projects I mentioned, there are a ton of partners and a ton of funding and support that goes into all of these. And I've just touched really lightly on each of them. So if you want more information on our organization, pacificrimconservation.org. If you want more information on the translocations for sea level rise, islandarts.org, and then our Kauai project is mihoku.org. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so I can see you guys and then go into the chat here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was such good information, Lindsay. That was amazing. Let's see.
Okay, I have a question on how did the longline fishery contribute to Griffin's death?
Yeah.
So what happens with longlining fishery is you have essentially a fish hook. There's thousands of fish hooks attached to what's called a branch line. So if you think of one long line and then you have like a hook every meter or so, he was going for one of those baited hooks. And so the same bait that was being used to attract the ahi is the same thing that albatross will eat. So we grabbed onto the bait and was hooked by the hook, pulled underwater and drowned. And that's how most albatrosses are impacted by bycatch.
Looks like there's a question from Uncle Bob. Uncle Bob, go ahead.
I noticed the on your Elipio map for Oahu that the whole northern end of the island didn't have any. Most of the concentrations were on the east end and the south shore. And I'm wondering if that you indicated that rats were one of the reasons that they don't do so well. But does that mean there's a whole lot more rats on this on the upper end of Oahu, or the breeding populations got so small they just couldn't keep it together and they just keep shrinking where they are?
So it's a combination. That's a really good question. I think what actually is happening with Elapayo is they still are slightly vulnerable to disease. They definitely have a tolerance for it, otherwise they'd be gone completely, but they're still vulnerable. And so the spots that you're seeing them on are actually the highest points on the island still. And so the temperature there is just cool enough that in the winter, they're not getting bitten as much by mosquitoes. And so the birds that are vulnerable to disease still have a chance to actually reproduce. And so I think it's actually a function of elevation rather than rat density, because I can tell you the rats are dense everywhere. It really doesn't matter where you are, you're going to have a lot of rats.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. Okay, if we do have time, if you wanted to show that video now, and then we can go into Sheldon's portion if you want, Lindsay.
Sure, let me pull it up 1 second. So I'm gonna, instead of playing the actual file, I'm gonna do it as a video, and then that way I'll put the link in the chat just in case. I've had issues with the sound not playing. So 1 second here. Okay, can you guys see?
Yep.
I'm going to start playing it, and I actually can't see you. So if you aren't able to hear the audio, if someone can speak up. So
Okay.
so hang on. Can you hear music?
Yep, it sounds
Okay.
good.
I will full screen this then.
Okay.
Filming this.
It's already morning, so they'll see you in a little bit.
Yeah.
We'll see you in a few hours.
All right, you guys are ready. Welcome home. Black-footed albatrosses are one of our native seabird species. They're important for Hawaiian culture. They're also an important part of our ecosystem. And unfortunately today they're constrained to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. So they're part of Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea Marine National Monument, where about 95% of their worldwide population is. And unfortunately, they have chosen to nest on the perimeter of these atolls, which are rapidly eroding due to sea level rise. They imprint on their natal location where they were born at a little over 1 month of age. So the idea is you bring them to a place when they're young enough, they'll come back to that location as an adult and start a new breeding colony. But the birds actually did great. They arrived without any problems. It was more the humans that were stressed out during everything.
James Campbell, historically, if you go far back enough, would have been a seabird colony. And then looking at the models and trying to predict what climate change is going to do to sea level, this is actually a really safe spot. Having an area, 16 acres, where you are 100% predator free, it's exciting. It's the best tool that we have for conservation in Hawaii.
It takes a lot of work to raise these birds. One of the most important things is to always keep things really clean and sterile, and to make sure that you're feeding the birds in such a way that if one was to get sick, you wouldn't pass it to the other bird. There's a lot of responsibility that goes there. We have a mixture that is Pedialyte, squid, 2 types of fish, a multivitamin, and calcium. Essentially, when they're very small, they're just getting fat. They eat and they sleep, and it's exhausting to grow as fast as they do. We usually put them out inside their A-frame, and it's really exciting to see because the chicks instantly start making it how they want it to be. They start scratching out a little nest cup, essentially. It's really neat to watch.
The cute or maybe sad thing is when we turned on the sound system, it broadcast calls to attract adult birds in. They clearly knew they were albatrosses because they waddled up to the speakers and started begging for food. So it's good that they weren't begging from us, but they were begging from the speakers, which told us they imprinted on the right species.
You know, the hand rearing time is about 4.5 months. which is a long time. But when you think about some of these birds, when we start, they're 200 to 300 grams. And then at the top of their growth curve, some of them are over 4,000 grams. And another interesting thing about it, when we start, they have a 30 to 40 millimeter wing. And when they fledge, they have a wingspan of over 6 feet. He's getting to this stage of the game. So it is a lot of growing in a really short amount of time. But another important process is that we raise well-adjusted birds that don't associate humans with food. And one of the things that helps with that is that we feed them in the morning and they spend the rest of the day with each other. The actual leaving of the bird is kind of a weeks process. We start to see some really clumsy standing up, flapping, and then they just slowly get a little better at that. And at first it looks pretty goofy, and then I know things have gotten a little bit more serious because they start to making short little flights. There's a behavioral component to it. That bird's not ready to go, he or she's going nowhere. There's almost like a flip that just switches in the birds. And once it switches, I can't keep them here if I wanted to. And that's really kind of a cool thing to see, because they do know what to do, and instinct is driving them to go. And up until that point, you just gotta keep them healthy, and it's a little bit of a waiting game.
You see things happening at such a fast pace with climate change that something needs to be done as quickly as possible. And I think it's really special to see something like this, where you have people from the military, you have U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, you have all the NGOs, and everybody's just coming together, and we see a problem, they're just getting it done.
Okay, so that is a little video, and I'll put it, anyone who might want to watch it later, in the chat. So that is the project that's been going on at Kahuku for the last 5 years.
Wow, that was fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us. They are cute little buggers, aren't they?
About you.
There was one more question in the chat for the black-footed albatross that were displaced in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands from storms and sea level rise. Where do you think they now nest?
I think most of them went to the next closest island, which is Turn Island, just a few miles away in the same atoll. And I was just there in March, and it was incredibly crowded with black-footed albatrosses, like they're running out of space. And so I think they chose the next best spot, but the density is going way up, which means they're hitting their carrying capacity.
Great. Thank you so much, Lindsay. I appreciate it. Oh, one quick one. What happens to parents and chick relationships when they are removed?
Yeah, so we get that one a lot, because I think a lot of us that are parents, or anyone even who's not, can empathize with that. Honestly, the adults usually walk away, almost like, oh, all right, I'm done here. And they normally, they will snap at us a little bit, but usually they're gone almost instantly. And I think, these birds raise a chick every year for the most part, and they're used to a good portion of their chicks dying. So I think this is just a normal event for them. And the chicks definitely don't see us as their parents. I think that's important, that we take them when they've already imprinted. In general, they really don't like us, which is a good thing. We want them to kind of be a little bit afraid of people if they're going to be coming back to this island. So yeah, not much happens. The adults will lay an egg and raise a chick the next year like they normally would, and it appears to not really disrupt them too much.
Oh, mahalo so much for the work that you do, Lindsay. Let's go ahead and pass it over to Sheldon. And then what we'll do at the end is we'll go back and revisit if there were any questions for either speaker today. Okay, Sheldon, take it away.
Okay. Let's see, let me know when you can see the presentation.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, and then can you see my my cursor moving around?
Yep, I sure can.
great.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, well, that was freaking amazing, Lindsay, as usual. And I am really appreciative to be able to speak with all of you about how local communities can restore native coastal habitat in the face of climate change. And Lindsay has set this up perfectly. She's done a lot, explain the problem of our seabirds nesting in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands and those islands going underwater. So that's going to save a lot of time for this. And, our sea turtles are also facing a similar fate in terms of over 90% of them were nesting on East Island at French Frigate Shoals or Lalo that Lindsay mentioned. And so those turtles are also looking for new places to nest. And I'll mention a little bit about turtles at the end of this talk, but most of this talk is focused on community stewardship and seabirds and focused in our own community. I wanted to start by just giving a big mahalo to Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea for just being amazing stewards on the North Shore and for the work that's been done in Sharks Cove, and also for hosting science talk stories like this and other things. And then I also want to give a big mahalo to North Shore Community Land Trust, 808 Cleanups, Hawaii Marine Animal Response, and Mālama Inahonu for engaging our communities here on Oahu and just making this island a better, safer place for native species. I'm going to start with just a little bit of general information about community stewardship and habitat restoration, and then go in to some details about how seabirds fit in. I'll use examples from Kahuku Point, and then also Vavamalu, which is there on the South Shore, and then a few other locations if there's time. I'll talk a little bit about ongoing and emerging threats, although Lindsay did a great job, so I'll just reiterate some of the things that she said, and then talk about how you can get involved if you aren't already involved. So I work for Pacific Islands Coastal Program. This program is one of 24 that are throughout the US and the Caribbean. And the way the program works is that we create collaborative and voluntary partnerships to restore habitat. And our partnerships can involve private landowners, nonprofits, federal and state organizations, just about anyone. And what we do is we provide funds and technical assistance. And there's a focus on landscape scale. So the predator control that Lindsay was talking about at this landscape scale and vector control like mosquito control is also, those are both priorities for the program. And then so is community-based stewardship. And so that's what I'm going to talk about now. And these projects the projects that I'm going to focus on today aren't the only community-based stewardship going on the island, but they're projects that I've been involved with and been providing technical assistance to as part of Pacific Islands Coastal Program. And so all of these projects are based in this concept of Lau Lima, many hands working together. And community members working cooperatively help in the recovery of coastal ecosystems that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And that is itself the definition of ecological restoration, just recovering systems that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And so there's a variety of activities that we can participate in to restore ecosystems. And I can't see the chat, but I'm hoping that you all will type in some restoration activities, some things that we can do to make natural places better. And then Jenny, I was hoping maybe you could read some of them to me.
Sure thing. I will watch the chat and I will let you know as soon as some come in.
Yeah, so these are actions, that we're doing around us that you all are doing at Sharks Cove as part of Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea. So just, yeah, type in whatever you've been part of or what you'd like to see happen.
Not seeing anything yet, Sheldon, but I can add one just off the top of my head.
Okay.
And for me, is something that we deal with a lot is just human use in general. So just the presence of humans. So
yeah, so like
looking at
limiting
less humans.
limiting human access, right?
Yeah, limiting access. I'm seeing, okay, so now they're coming in. More native plants is one.
Yes.
Also more volunteers is another.
Awesome. I love it. Yeah. And like that limiting human access is huge for us on Oahu, right? You walk out to Kaena Point State Park where walkways aren't delineated and you see that there's just been trampling everywhere, right? So if you look on this slide here on the left, you'll see some symbolic fencing that's been put in on the South Shore at Vavamalu, just to sort of mark, pathways for people so that they don't wander aimlessly and trample vegetation. So yeah, those are our things. And here I'm going to give you sort of a list of some other things. Revegetation, that's something that was mentioned. Erosion control, that's basically what Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea did at Sharks Cove by outplanting native species. Fencing, so we could have predator-proof fencing, that like the fencing that Lindsay mentioned, or symbolic fencing, like the fencing you see here on the left. Removal of invasive species, obviously. Vector control, which has been mentioned. Species translocations. Terrestrial and marine protected areas, like what we see at Sharks Cove. Limits on take. Prescribed fire. Habitat corridors, including like underpasses and overpasses that will link natural areas that have been separated because of development. And restoring water flow, like dam removal, which we're hearing more and more of. For example, the Elwha River in Oregon, where a large dam was removed so that we can restore this natural water flow and habitat for those stream species. So there's a lot of different restoration activities that we can be involved in. And the goal of these activities is to return an ecosystem to a condition similar in ecological structure and function to what existed prior to site disturbance or degradation. And as Lindsay mentioned, many of these ecosystems in Hawaii have lost large numbers of species due to extinction. She focused on birds, but I want to give some examples of some missing components, just some cool stuff that we're never going to see because they're not here anymore. For example, there were 9 species of rail, which are kind of upright flightless birds that were common on island ecosystems throughout the Pacific and were mostly flightless. And so the first things to go extinct when humans colonized those areas. We had 4 species of ibis, which are these birds with down-curved bills that feed in shallow water areas. We had a turtle-jawed moa nalo, and you can see the depiction here on the right. We think that this species was a browser and might have filled a niche that's normally occupied by a browsing mammal, like maybe a deer in mainland areas. We had 2 stilt owls, a giant sea eagle, and then all sorts of cool invertebrates that I could probably talk about forever. When I did my PhD, I was studying community ecology, but part of that was really looking closely at the invertebrate fauna in coastal areas. And I only found over a 5-year study, I found about 5% of the insects in the coastal areas on Oahu were native. So we just lost, almost everything. And there was some cool stuff like a giant cricket. I have this picture here of a weta, which is a closely related species, and this one's found in New Zealand. And I'm not sure if anyone's been to New Zealand and has seen these wetas. Sometimes they'll have wetza hotels in natural areas where you can open it up and see what they're doing inside. If you ever go there, it's totally worth doing that. But anyway, so we're missing these components. However, some species did survive, but they were just extirpated from areas that they once occupied. And seabirds are one of those groups. Seabirds used to be abundant in the main Hawaiian Islands. And by the way, this is a masked booby juvenile that was following me around on Nihoa a few years ago. And seabirds used to be abundant in the main Hawaiian Islands. The majority of species nest in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, as Lindsay mentioned, on atolls and low islands that are 2 meters or less above sea level. And so, all that habitat is already being lost and will continue to be lost. And so as those areas become less suitable, we need to create safe places in the main Hawaiian Islands through landscape scale predator control and habitat restoration. And there's a variety of ways to do that. And community stewardship is one of those. And so an obvious question is like, why do we care about seabirds? Why are we going through all this trouble to bring seabirds back to the main Hawaiian Islands? Why are they important? And seabirds are important for a variety of reasons, and I'll just touch on a few here. But seabirds bring marine-derived resources from coastal marine areas and sometimes pelagic areas further out to sea, and they deposit them back on the land in the form of guano or bird poop, or through decomposition, when chicks or adults die, or just through food that's dropped or thrown up. And so that's a lot of nutrients that are going into the land. So the first reason they're important is they transfer these nutrients from offshore onto terrestrial areas. Burrowing seabirds like wedge-tailed shearwaters, which that's what you see in this picture is a newly hatched wedge-tailed shearwater from Laysan Island. Burrowing shearwaters will distribute organic matter lower into the soil profile, so they'll mix the soil. Seabirds also disperse seeds and even invertebrates, especially for those species that move between islands. Some seabird species are more prone to do that than others. And the recovery of seabird colonies is linked to healthier coral reefs. And this is newer research, linking coral reefs and seabirds. But what's been published, there's one paper showing that nutrients from seabird colonies run off and enhance growth of coral species and their associated algae. And so they can make coral grow faster. The presence of seabirds can make coral grow faster. Reefs around seabird colonies are also more resilient to bleaching events. So if we restore seabirds, if we have more seabirds closer to the levels that maybe were here historically, we're going to have healthier reefs. Okay, and so now I'm going to jump into just talking about how this plays out using community stewardship. And I'll start by talking about this project at Kahuku Point up here, and then a little bit about this project down at Vavamalu on the South Shore. But I also think it's important to mention, especially if I forget later, that there is community stewardship of seabird colonies, of wedge-tailed shearwater colonies, that's ongoing at Kahuku Golf Course, Kailua Beach Park, the Freeman Reserve, and then also there's some work at Chun's that's just starting up. Okay, so let's jump into Kahuku Point. Kahuku Point is the most northern point on Oahu. The area was protected in 2015 under a conservation easement, the Kahuku Kavela Forever initiative. And so not only was Kahuku Point protected, as conservation land, but also Kavela Bay. And planning for ecosystem restoration began in 2015. This is a really cool project. It's led by the North Shore Community Land Trust. The workhorse is regular community work days. And the Land Trust has just done a great job reaching out to experts, in organizations and agencies and getting them to be part of this. And so that's included my program, Pacific Islands Coastal Program, but also Partners for Fish and Wildlife, which is another U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service program. Turtle Bay is involved through their nonprofit. Hawaii Marine Animal Response plays a huge role. Gray Boar Consulting helps with predator control. And then DLNR is helping to grow plants that are no longer present at the point, but were present historically. So we do invasive plant and mammal removal, native plant restoration, Laysan albatross stewardship, and there is an element of monitoring outcomes. And so that's what I wanted to kind of share with you now, just so you can see what this work that's driven by the community, what it translates into. So I have these 10 randomly established original monitoring points and photo points. There's 3 photo points and 10 monitoring points. And this was sort of when we first started, this was the area we were tackling. And you can see in this graph, if you look along the x-axis, it's year, and the y-axis is percent invasive plants. And you can see that, invasive plant percentage has dropped off over time to nearing 0 now. And then alternatively, if we have native percent native plant cover here on the y-axis, you can see over time it has gotten better and better. So this is, a good indication that what we're doing is working. And that is one thing that is sometimes missing from community initiatives, is a way to quantify or evaluate it. And so this is, shows clear results. Here's some photo point monitoring comparisons here. These 2 photos were taken from the exact same spot, 2015 on the left, 2022 on the right. And you can see, all of this tall ironwood has been removed, and even some of the short stuff here. So this is kind of a big change over time. And then here you can see in the area that was dominated already by relatively healthy native plants here in 2015, you can see over time, especially with the addition of the symbolic fencing, which is visible in the 2022 picture on the right, you can see areas like this clump of vegetation in the middle, and see how much bigger it's gotten here. And then we've been able to remove the ironwood and just increase the cover of native species, which is good for a variety of things. And so as we've, cleared areas, cleared habitat, cleared tall trees, we've made the area a little more appealing to Laysan albatrosses. And, Laysan albatross sightings aren't new for this area. There's been sightings since at least the 1990s. I couldn't find earlier sightings, but they might be there. They're attracted by that large open area at the old Marconi Station and the Turtle Bay Golf Course. From the pictures Lindsay showed you from Midway and from Turn, those areas are flat and free of obstacles for the most part. And, albatrosses aren't called goony birds for nothing. Like, they can have a hard time maneuvering around obstacles. And so they love that big open area over at Marconi Station and the golf course. But that area at Marconi Station hasn't historically been safe, and there's been periodic reports of adults killed by dogs. There were 7 adults killed one year. And as the North Shore Community Land Trust has cleared the invasive ironwoods, so Lindsay said, if you build it, they will come. Well, in this case, if you clear it, they will come. And I'll show you a series of pictures kind of showing that they're starting to use this area that's been cleared more and more. But the real reason that the albatrosses have been able to survive here is that the Land Trust, in cooperation with the Coastal Program and Gray Boar Consulting, just done a landscape level predator control, primarily mongoose control, and we've been able to reduce mongoose density by 90%. So that's been amazing, and it's allowed these albatross to persist. And so here's sort of the nuts and bolts of things, how it looks. In 2017, we had 4 nests. They were the first Laysan albatross nest that we had found since we started restoration. There had been others in that area, but the eggs were taken because it wasn't safe to nest there and used for egg swaps. So once these nests were found, we started the small scale mongoose control. The one egg that we were really focused on protecting ended up being inviable, but that got us moving for 2018 when we did this more comprehensive predator control. And we added volunteers from Hawaii Marine Animal Response, a few of which are on this call right now. These are community members that are trained and dedicated to these birds. And that was a game changer for us to have these volunteers out there. And I'll talk more about that a little later. And then in 2019, we contracted with Gray Boar Consulting so that we could, expand our predator control. And also Gray Boar Consulting is really helpful with fixing traps and other things that break over time that the Land Trust didn't have time to do. And then in 2020, after, I presented the vegetation monitoring data, and we could see that at a few of the points, cover was going down, and it was because people just didn't know where to walk. They were just trampling vegetation. It was mostly right out towards the point. So the Land Trust immediately started working on symbolic fencing in that area. And then that was the year we also began collaborating with DLNR to replace key plant species that were no longer there. And so I guess the thing I've forgotten to mention as we've gone up is we've gone from 4 nests in 2017 to 13 nests in 2020, and then all the way up to 17 nests in 2021, the current year we're in. And this is also the year that we started outplanting rare and extirpated plant species like sandalwood, which is doing great, and nohu, or I'm blanking on Tribulus cystoides, and then also Capparis, the big showy white flowered plant. So it's been really fulfilling to replace some of these species that have been extirpated from the area. And then we also got up to 17 nests, which was pretty cool. Okay, and then when you look at the split here in red, you'll see nests that are at Marconi Station, and then in blue, nests at Kuhuku Point. You can see that the Marconi Station nests have stayed rather stagnant between 3 and 5. And then as we've done more restoration and cleared more of the tall trees at Kuhuku Point, we've made the habitat more appealing for Laysan albatross, and that is the plan. It would be really amazing to get some kind of conservation easement in place over at Marconi, but so far all of our efforts to do that have not worked out. So here's a map I'm going to show you just how the nests have been distributed from one year to the next. So here's the 2017 nest. There were 2 others that I don't have a GPS coordinate for. That was right at the start. And then in 2018, we had those 3 nests over at Marconi in the middle of the field there. And then we just had started clearing this area up here. We cleared it right before the season started. And then we had this nest at that season, just right after we started clearing the ironwood. And then we had a few other nests along here. And so you can see the nests have increased over time up to this year. And although this looks forested, it's not anymore. This is an older satellite image. And so the birds love the open areas, but they also like to walk into shaded areas. And so that's what we see happening up here on the golf course. The birds will land, and they'll kind of land on the mound here, and they'll walk over into nesting areas here. And then we've also seen more Malka nests that have forced us to expand our predator control even further. And so in terms of nest outcomes, here's some cute chicks from Kure Atoll, by the way. Okay, so for nest outcomes, here, you can see from 2017 to 2021, we've had increases in nest each year, but we haven't had, increases in chicks that have fledged, and chicks that have hatched have varied from year to year. You know, we had 6 eggs hatch in 2018, 3 in 2019, 5 in 2020, and then 3 this year. And we've never had more than 3 chicks fledge. And then this year, we've had kind of a rough year. We have 1 chick remaining. Fingers crossed that chick, whose name is Lucky, will hopefully fledge. This isn't really surprising because it's been a difficult year for lake-sand albatross throughout their range. And, you know, although the number of chicks fledged is much less than the number of nests initiated, this is not surprising. I talked with Lindsay about this early on, and it's because it's a new colony. These are wild adults. It's a new colony, and so it's likely young birds, and colonies with young birds typically have high rates of abandonment, and that's definitely what we've seen. So for threats, Lindsay went over a lot of the threats, you know, in addition to climate change. Invasive mammals are a big one. And I just wanted to drive this home because these pictures were taken about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, at a brand new wedge-tailed shearwater colony on the east side. Someone found 30 dead birds, dead wedge-tailed shearwaters. Most of them were decapitated, like the one here on the right. None of them were eaten. We set up trail cams, and we only saw this cat. We saw this cat over multiple nights. And I went out there about 3 weeks ago, and just to see, like, did the cat kill every bird in the colony? That's kind of what it seemed like. So I went out there at night, and I was doing wedge-tailed shearwater calls to see if I would get a response. And it was silent, except for when I turned around to walk away, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, and it was this cat stalking me. So presumably, you know, any bird that came back, this cat, if it called, this cat was going to stalk it. And, you know, it's a fat cat. I don't think it's a feral cat. I think it's someone's free roaming pet. And so I just can't emphasize enough how harmful it is to have these invasive mammals on the landscape, you know, and it is a 100% solvable problem, and we know how to solve it. Other threats, we found that tropical fire ants, they actually killed one of our chicks. This is the adult that was trying to protect the chick. You know, it was incubating the egg and then brooding the chick when it first hatched. And so all of those little dots that you see on this chick's feet are fire ant bites. And that chick ended up being overwhelmed soon after it hatched and died. And we sent it away for a necropsy just to verify the cause of death. And Dr. Terry Work was able to verify that it was due to these tropical fire ants. You know, Hawaii, not only does Hawaii have no native mosquitoes, but Hawaii also has no native ants. And so that's something that can be problematic. Pox are also a problem. Pox, just like avian malaria, is vectored by mosquitoes. Almost all the chicks get it, and almost all the chicks develop these horrific lesions, but they somehow recover. We did have 1 chick with permanent damage. The culmen, or the top of the bill, didn't grow as long as the bottom of the bill, and so its bill was slightly malformed, and then it also had loss of sight in its right eye. So again, you know, these are vectored by mosquitoes. This landscape scale mosquito control is something that we have the technology for. We just need the political will and the funding to move ahead and make it happen. You know, another threat are humans, right? And so the human threat is dealt with on this project by these volunteers from Hawaii Marine Animal Response. They are the Moli Mamas, and they are trained community volunteers. They monitor nests and chicks daily. They conduct on-site outreach to community members, golfers, visitors. They are amazing. They assist with signage, symbolic fencing, and banding adults and chicks. And they have been a key to the success of the chicks because they're just present. And so if a problem emerges, if a chick gets entangled in something, if someone's trying to feed the chicks something, they are there to help. And that's going to be more and more important, as there's more development on the Marconi side and, as chicks fledge and it's just amazing to have them there on the daily basis, protecting these chicks. So we do band adults and chicks. This is one of the Moley mamas, Laura, banding Lockie. This was just a couple weeks ago. We band all adults and chicks to increase our understanding of movement among sites on Oahu and elsewhere. Also breeding site fidelity, will these chicks return to our site at Kahuku Point, or are they going to go, less than a mile down the road and go to James Campbell? This will allow us to know, we definitely get some exchanges between James Campbell because Kahuku Point is so close. And we definitely get turtle exchanges. We have turtles that breed at both sites. And then this also helps us evaluate age of return. So birds receive one, quote, permanent Fish and Wildlife Service metal band that's got a number engraved on it that you can't see from a distance. And then on the other leg, they get a color band that have letters and numbers that you can read from a distance, so you don't have to disturb the bird. So if you do see a banded bird and you want to know more about it, you can take note of the color and the letter number combo, and you can submit it to www.reportband.gov, and you'll get all the info on where and how and who banded that bird. Typically, if the color band is purple and it starts with V as in Victor, it's a bird that was banded on Oahu. Okay, so now I wanted to transition into talking about this Vavamalu ecosystem restoration. It's another example of community stewardship, but it's quite different from the work at Kahuku Point. It's not as large and extensive a project. It doesn't have a lot of funding. It is really powered, from 808 cleanups who adopted the site. Michael Lofton adopted the site around 2015 or 2016 and started weekly work days. He reached out to me for some technical assistance and later to state parks. And then at this time, it overlapped with work we were doing with Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. So we were on site doing research, looking at limiting factors with Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. So we were able to work together and really enhance the habitat of the site. So the weekly workday started in about 2015. There's invasive plant control by the community members. If they have any question about a plant, whether it's native or not, they'll shoot me a picture of it and I'll let them know. We also have collaboration with DLNR to grow appropriate sourced and clean plants for the site so that when they are removing invasive plant species, they're leaving open spaces. And so now with this work with DLNR, we're able to repopulate those areas with plants that are from seeds collected at the site or seeds nearby, and we're adding new species to the site. We added symbolic fencing in 2016, and we're actually expanding that tomorrow. So if you feel like having a work day tomorrow out at Vavamalu near Sandy's, let me know. We need some extra help. This is what the symbolic fencing looks like, and it's allowed the habitat, given it a break from people walking on it incessantly, and you can see that change over time. So on the left is 2015, on the right is 2020. And you can just see that these trails in between these patches of vegetation are closing in. Some of the trails with the symbolic fencing, we try to maintain the trails that most people use and just cut off extraneous trails. And, we can change that over time. Like if the community really seems to want to use a certain path that's not open, we'll open it back up and close something else. So we're trying to work with the people that use the site to establish this symbolic fencing. And I have to say, there hasn't been one time that I've been out there that strangers haven't come up to me and when they've seen us working and thanked us for the efforts there. So if you haven't been to the site lately, go check it out. One of the really cool things about this site is it's got a lot of Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. Hawaiian has one group of native bees, and they're all in the genus Hylaeus. They're collectively known as Hawaiian yellow-faced bees. There's 63 known species. All of them are endemic. 7 were listed as endangered in 2016. They were the first bees to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. They were once common and widespread throughout the Hawaiian Islands, and one of the old-time entomologists, Perkins, commented that they were almost the most ubiquitous of any Hawaiian insects. And sadly now they currently survive in these really small and isolated populations. So as I mentioned, we have this ongoing study on how to expand populations of yellow-faced bees and also what their limiting factors are. And so that's dovetailed well with this habitat restoration driven by 808 cleanups. It has enhanced bee habitat. The area has relatively easy access. So there are school groups, which is what you see in this picture, these kids going in, checking out the bees. I worked with DLNR to get signage up so you can learn a lot about the bees while you're there. It's the only place that we know of on Oahu where these bees are nesting in the ground, and they're nesting in coral rubble. So you can see kind of the white rubble in the background there. And that's really cool and a little bit horrific because people come to this site and they'll gather a bunch of the coral rubble on the beach, and they'll ring a fire pit with it and then burn all the baby bees. So that's been hard, but 808 Cleanups does outreach walks, and the number of fires that we're seeing is very reduced. And in general, the community members love the bees, and they are really good about sharing accurate information about them. And since we're talking about seabirds today, I guess the question is, are there seabirds there? And the answer is, well, we see them fly by and we see them on the ground. There was a lace-sand albatross on the ground last year, but there's been no breeding detected. And I think that if we decided to do landscape scale predator control in this area, or say we wanted to have a predator fence from Vavamalu all along protecting the Makapu'u area, we would get nesting seabirds, at least wedge-tail shearwaters, quickly, and likely other species as well. And if we didn't get them, we could potentially translocate them there if it was a safe place that was going to be protected in perpetuity. Okay, so just some final take-home messages. Habitat improvement via community work days with technical assistance from biologists is resulting in habitat, ecological restoration here in our communities on our island. There's more cover of native plant species and higher diversity. Predator control has enabled seabird nesting at Pupuku Point and could be used in other areas. We know that's necessary. So if we want seabirds in other areas, we can do that. Community members are key to getting the work done and to spreading the word about vulnerable resources. And if you want to get involved on Oahu, I'm assuming a lot of you already know about North Shore Community Land Trust and Hawaii Marine Animal Response, which does a lot of emergency response as well as seabird stewardship. 808 Cleanups uses this model where they have a site adoption. You go out and you can do debris cleanups, and depending on what you want to do, you can also add invasive plant removal. And then they share their cleanups on social media, which encourages other people, shows you that there's all these people working in your community to do things to protect the environment. And then what I haven't mentioned today is Mālama Inahonu, which is, we all know from Laniakea, where they do outreach to protect basking turtles. But I also work directly with them to find, monitor, and protect sea turtle nests on Oahu. And so just a quick kind of public announcement here is that Oahu is seeing this crazy increase in sea turtle nests since 2020. We went from having 1 or 2 or 0 sea turtle nests to having 60. And nesting is most common on the North Shore. If you see any sign of nesting, so if you see a turtle crawl above high tide line or any kind of digging with the back flippers, please call Hawaii Marine Animal Response and they'll let us know. The main threat for these turtles nesting in our community on the North Shore is lighting, beachside lighting, but also lighting that might be miles away, but is still visible on the beach because the light is unshielded. And that has caused hundreds of sea turtle babies to die in the last couple of years. I can tell you horror stories, but I won't, except for maybe one from Keiki Beach last year where we had sea turtles crawling into illegal bonfires on the beach. So there's your one bad story, but I could tell you many more. So just, it's important for us to be mindful about lighting at night, to turn off all unnecessary lights and to use wildlife friendly bulbs. And you all probably know to do that, but maybe your neighbors don't. So share information. We have outreach materials with our Oahu turtle nesting project that we're happy to share. And then, if you do want to get involved in other community projects protecting seabirds, Hawaii Marine Animal Response monitors Kahuku Golf Course and Kailua Beach Park. And you can also join the communities at Freeman Reserve or at Chun's Reef. And if you want more information about that, just let me know. And then the last final thought. So as a final thought, it's up to us to shape our communities, to shape the places that we want to live. And community-based stewardship is proactive versus reactive. It's an approach that brings positive reinforcement and is an effective force to increase understanding and these feelings of responsibility and increasing people's willingness to care for these places. So it's a powerful way to change behavior. And as we move into the future, I think this is a model that is really needed for communities, especially like those on Oahu that have a lot of people. And so I look forward to continuing to help as a community member here on the North Shore, and also in my professional capacity as someone who can provide technical assistance. And with that, questions.
Oh, mahalo, Sheldon. That was so good. I am just soaking up all of this information and learning so much. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but before we get to that, I actually had a question for you. And this is something that you and I have been talking about for years now. I'm a huge fan of boluses. And so for those of you who don't know, the bolus is well, Sheldon, you can probably explain it better, but in my version of what it is, it's the stuff that the bird gets rid of before it takes flight. So all the things they couldn't, all the things they can't digest. And normally those are natural things like squid beaks and some pine cones and, little things that are in there. But, we've gotten some boluses before from you folks, and they were from Curie Atoll. And we had our marine science students dissect them, and we found a lot of marine plastics in there. And we're really looking forward to dissecting the boluses from Kahuku Point. And so my question is, have you folks seen, deaths of birds on the North Shore from marine plastics, or that you think are attributed to marine plastics?
Yeah, so at Kahuku Point, we've had necropsies done of most of the chicks, and compared to what you see at Curie or at Midway, they have smaller amounts of plastic. And I feel like Lindsay, feel free to chime in, because I feel like Lindsay was a co-author on a paper talking about just that as you go south down the chain, there's less and less plastic. And we do see significantly less plastic in the boluses from Kahuku Point compared to Curie.
Yeah, and here, I'm going to put the link to the article there. We did a paper on this about 10 years ago and compared plastic content on Oahu versus Northwestern Islands, and it's about 1/10 of what's found there. So it's pretty uncommon to have issues from plastics in these birds. And at a population level, it doesn't appear to impact them. It's not to say that ingesting plastic is good, but we have not seen population changes as a result of that. And it's because albatross, thankfully, naturally cough out the hard parts of their diet. And I think that's why there's so much awareness for this, is because they expel the vast majority of it. So the good news is that they can deal with it up to a certain point. It certainly does cause mortality, but it's actually quite good in the main Hawaiian Islands. It's like one of the few good news things we can present. But the graphs and all of that are in the link I just gave on the paper in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, we're really looking forward to having the students do a comparison, and
Yeah,
we'll let you know what they find too, so to get some kind of updated info.
we're waiting for our one chick Lucky to hawk up that bolus this year, and we'll get that one for you as well.
Awesome. Hopefully you guys find it.
Yeah.
I can imagine that's a challenge, right? To find where
I've
where
actually
they go.
gotten shockingly good at it, but it's funny
Yeah.
because the first time I went to Cure, I was walking around in the interior of the island and I'm like, why is there just a carpet of plastic pieces here? And then all of a sudden it sinks in. It's all from birds that have brought that to feed their chicks, you know, and it is so incredibly disturbing, you know,
Yeah.
but thankfully, like Lindsay said, like they do have a way to get it out of their system. You know, it
Right.
can be hard when it has a sharp edge or something, but in general, they can throw it up.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so if we look back at the chat, there was a question from Uncle Bob about the yellow-faced bee, and he's wondering what is the best size of hole that we can drill into beechwood to support their life cycle?
Awesome, Uncle Bob. Well, I can give you all the details on that. So part of our work was to make we were calling them jokingly bee condos. And we had collected information from hundreds of natural bee nests. And so we found the perfect size for them. And I can send you a link to that paper that we published. I think it came out last year, year before. And the problem, one of the main limiting factors for yellow-faced bees and their nest is ants. So invasive ants, we found that they caused a 60% of the mortality in bee nests was related to invasive ants. There's other problems as well, but that's the main one. But there are areas, I'm seeing more at Kahuku Point. There is a really nice population across the front of the Marconi parcel, which makes me a little nervous just because we don't know what the future land use in that area is going to be. And then James Campbell has a lot of bees, and then there's some out at Kaena Point, but in between those areas, we don't have any bees. But Uncle Bob, I will send you that article, and I can even send you a picture, even give you a block if you want, that has holes already drilled in it.
Awesome.
Follow.
We'll have
You
to
can
put them
have a
at
friend
we'll have to
too.
put it at Kapo'o, Uncle Bob. We'll put it right in the native plants at Kapo'o. Awesome. Okay, I also see another question from Hiroko. She says, great presentations to both of you. Any future plans to put up fences like Kaena Point, considering many hotels coming up, and she mentions Turtle Bay area?
Yeah. So we have actually done some planning for predator-proof fence at Kahuku Point. I've talked a lot with Lindsay about it, and Tim at the Land Trust has also talked with Lindsay. And so there's some question about what is most cost effective given the size of it. So that is not off the table. And if we see that is something that is going to have a positive impact into the future, especially as there is more development at Turtle Bay, then I think that's something that I would support, and I would talk with the Land Trust about it. The advantage, there's a lot of advantages of having the predator-proof fence, but to me, the main advantage right now is we don't have any wedge-tailed shearwaters nesting out there. I mean, we see occasionally, we smell them. They, all the seabirds have a unique smell. And, but we never seen an egg or a chick out there. And if we had a predator-proof fence and we were eradicating rats, then we would have wedge-tailed shearwaters out there. The rats are especially rough on the smaller birds like bowlers, petrels, wedge-tailed shearwaters, boning petrel. So I love that idea, you know, and I envision that area, if we had a fence, you know, it could be an area that had a lot of different components of the seabird community nesting, and would be a complement to the work that's being done at James Campbell. You know, instead of having Lindsay's translocated birds, or, you know, having to come back to this relatively small area at James Campbell, like, I would like to see that whole north coast from Kahuku Point all the way to James Campbell protected in a way so that these seabirds, you know, aren't going through the gauntlet when they're coming home.
Yeah, just to add to that, so we are working with the refuge to fence the entire James Campbell National Wildlife Refuge. So that is in discussion. And the hard thing about a lot of these fences, first, is they're super expensive and there's a lot of maintenance that goes into them. So you have to have really a long-term commitment. And where there's two main considerations at the Kahuku Point area. One is that it wouldn't enclose it. It would be it'd go down to the shoreline in certain areas so that it wouldn't be preventing access to the water for either the birds or the people. When you have those open ends, you would leave it really vulnerable to animals coming in. And then the second part is the human access. So making sure that people still have access in the way that they're used to, but there would have to be a lot of behavior changes that would occur if a fence went in. You know, people walk their dogs, they use the area for recreation. And so there are changes that would need to be put in order to make sure there's biosecurity. So there's a lot of factors that go into it. And when there's public use, it's, you know, twice as many factors. So all those things to be considered, because if you can't keep the pests out, like if the changes that you're going to make to a fence alignment are going to make it so the pests can still get in, then you're better off just investing and doing a lot of predator control. We've seen that that can work. And so we're trying to figure out the best options for each site.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we sure do understand about the presence of human use. I know I mentioned it already, but, you know, for us at our spot in our coastal restoration that we try to do, you know, it sees thousands of people a day. And so it's a constant challenge. So we understand that completely. And thank you so much for all the work that both of you are doing. And, you know, I was explaining to Sheldon earlier that birds in general, seabirds and birds in general, native birds, is something that I know practically very little about. You know, I know a lot of stuff to do with the ocean, but the birds is the one thing that I was really looking forward to learning about. And I learned so much from both of you. And so just thank you so much. So I just want to check if anybody has any more questions. If so, now would be the time to bring them up. But if not, I think that is it for today. We get out of here a little hair early. But like I said, this is recorded and it will be on the website, on Mālama Pūpūkea-Waimea's website, which is pūpūkea-waimea.org, under the What We Do Marine Science tab, and you can find all of our marine science talks right there. Hiroko, I see you coming. Did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you to all of you, Jenny, to organize this, and to wonderful presenters. I just came back from Japan, and this kind of nature environment is so rare. And I was wondering if there is any move for all the organization to get connected with a Bureau of Tourism, that tourists will pay part of it to create this heavenly places. I was wondering, federal funding is very limited, and we experienced through the coronavirus era lockdown that we really depend on the tourism, but they were talking about the change of characteristic of tours. And I think all of your organization can get together and discuss with the Tourism Bureau. That's my thought.
Yeah, so that is something that, you know, we've been actively working towards on the North Shore, you know, to, like, Hawaii Tourism Authority has given funds for a long time to different projects, but obviously, you know, it's time to make a change in the way tourism is done in Hawaii, and to ensure that, you know, we have the infrastructure to support the tourism that is here, and to maybe have tourists have a more authentic experience when they come to the islands and be involved in some of this community stewardship. But there are some programs starting to do that, and the land trust is linked into that, but and 808 cleanups is as well, but there's nothing like, there's, you know, nothing, no laws or nothing mandating it at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Like,
You
I was
always ask
so sad that the green fee didn't pass. Like, I couldn't freaking believe that. Palau has had a green fee for 1,000,000 years, you know, that they use for conservation. And I was just gutted that we couldn't even pass a green fee. So,
you know, Lindsay made a really good point earlier that it's really important for us to support good stuff just as much as it's important for us to sort of protest the junk stuff. And so it's going to be hopefully reintroduced again this next legislative session. And, you know, maybe we can all collectively, you know, try to help make folks more aware of that. I was looking at the testimony on that, and there wasn't a whole lot just from the general public. And so it'll be an opportunity for change in the future.
Yeah, and that is a really good point for us to support, you know, ways to address the feral cat colonies, ways to address mosquito control. We want to support that as much as possible. And I know we're all busy and it's hard to keep track of everything, but through organizations like yours, you know, you can help get the word out. I can help get the word out. Lindsay can. And so I think that's really important.
Awesome. Okay, Lindsay, any final thoughts before we close today? And then I'll check with you, Sheldon, and then we'll end.
I guess just to sort of wrap up that immediate conversation is the state senator for you guys really is pretty conservation oriented. And so if there's something you guys want to see, approach Senator Riviere, and he is likely to take that on. And sorry, there's a huge truck driving by. Create a bill out of it. So you don't have to wait for others to introduce something that you like. You can actually propose that yourself. So don't be afraid to start that process.
Yeah, definitely. He is really great about it for sure. Okay, Sheldon, any final thoughts before we close?
Yeah, if you want to find Gil, he's down at the pickleball courts on Thursday nights at about 6:30.
Everything is done.
I love it. Awesome. Okay, you guys, thank you again. Mahalo nui so much. Anybody who watches this later, feel free to reach out. You can contact us and we can connect you, or you can rewind and look at the emails and things that were listed on the presentations today. So mahalo nui, thank you so much.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everybody.